Captain Sarah Mitchell gripped the control stick of her A-10 Thunderbolt II, better known as the Warthog, as warning lights flashed across her cockpit like angry red eyes. The aircraft shuddered violently, and she could hear the grinding sound of damaged metal even over the roar of her twin engines. Below her, the desert landscape of Nevada stretched endlessly, broken only by the occasional mountain range that jutted up like ancient teeth.
Hawkeye 21, this is Desert Control, crackled the voice in her headset.
We're reading multiple system failures on your aircraft. What's your status? Sarah's hands moved automatically across the controls, her years of training taking over even as her heart pounded in her chest. She was 32 years old, a veteran pilot with over 2,000 flight hours, but she had never faced anything quite like this. The hydraulic pressure was dropping fast, her left engine was showing signs of failure, and, worst of all, her landing gear indicator was flashing between green and red. Desert Control, Hawkeye 21, she responded, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. I've got hydraulic failure, possible engine damage, and uncertain gear status.
I need to find a place to put this bird down, and I need it now.
The desert below offered few options. Sarah's eyes scanned the horizon desperately, looking for any sign of a runway, a road, or even a flat piece of ground large enough to accommodate her aircraft. The A-10 was tough, built to survive, but even the mighty Warthog had its limits. That's when she saw it, a thin black line cutting through the desert like a scar. It was Interstate 50, one of the loneliest highways in America, but right now it looked like salvation. The road was straight and mostly empty, with only a few scattered vehicles visible in the distance.
Desert Control, I've got visual on Interstate 50, Sarah transmitted. I'm going to attempt an emergency landing on the highway. Clear all traffic in the area immediately.
Negative, Hawkeye 21, came the reply.
That's a civilian highway.
We cannot authorize, this isn't a request, Sarah cut them off, her voice sharp with urgency.
I'm coming down one way or another.
You can either help me or watch me crash. The radio fell silent for a moment, then, another voice came through, calmer, more authoritative.
Hawkeye 21, this is Colonel Anderson. We're clearing the highway now. Emergency services are en route to your position. You're cleared for emergency landing.
Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she knew the hardest part was still ahead. Landing a military fighter jet on a civilian highway was not something they taught in flight school, at least not as a preferred option. She began her descent, watching her altimeter spin downward as the ground rushed up to meet her. The Warthog responded sluggishly to her controls, fighting her every input. She could feel the aircraft wanting to roll to the left, probably due to damage from whatever had caused her system failures.
Sarah had been on a routine training mission over the Nevada test range when everything had gone wrong.
One moment she was practicing low-level attack runs, the next her aircraft was trying to kill her. As she descended through 5,000 feet, Sarah caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. In her rearview mirrors, she could see two F-16 Fighting Falcons approaching fast from behind. The sleek fighters were closing the distance rapidly, their pilots no doubt curious about why an A-10 was making an emergency landing on a public highway.
Unknown F-16s approaching from the rear, Sarah transmitted on the emergency frequency. This is Hawkeye 21 making emergency landing on Interstate 50. Maintain safe distance.
The lead F-16 pilot's voice crackled through the radio, young and confident.
Hawkeye 21, this is Viper 1. We're here to provide escort.
What's your emergency? Multiple system failures, Sarah replied tersely, her attention focused on the approaching highway. Landing gear status unknown, hydraulics failing. I need clear airspace for approach. She was down to 3,000 feet now, and the highway was becoming more distinct. She could see individual cars and trucks scattered along the road, some of them pulling over to the shoulder as word of the emergency landing spread. The Nevada Highway Patrol was doing their job, she realized gratefully. At 2,000 feet, Sarah made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Her landing gear indicator was still flashing intermittently, and she couldn't risk a belly landing with uncertain gear status. She reached for the manual gear extension lever, a backup system that would force her landing gear down using gravity and springs rather than hydraulic pressure. The lever was stiff, requiring more force than usual. Sarah gritted her teeth and pulled hard, feeling something give way inside the aircraft's belly. A moment later, she felt the satisfying thunk of the gear locking into position, and her indicator light turned solid green.
Gear down and locked, she announced, relief evident in her voice.
Behind her, the two F-16 pilots watched in fascination and growing concern. They had never seen an A-10 attempt a highway landing before, and they were beginning to understand just how serious this situation was. The lead pilot, Captain Jake Morrison, keyed his radio.
Desert Control, Viper 1. We need medical and fire suppression at the landing site.
This could get ugly. Sarah was down to 1,000 feet now, lined up with the Arrow Strait Highway. Cars and trucks had pulled over to both shoulders, creating a clear path down the center of the road. She could see flashing lights in the distance, emergency vehicles positioning themselves for whatever was about to happen. The A-10's approach speed was much faster than anything the highway had been designed to handle. Sarah was coming in hot, probably 20 or 30 miles per hour faster than she would prefer, but she didn't have much choice. Her damaged aircraft was bleeding speed and altitude, and she needed to get on the ground before she lost control entirely. At 500 feet, Sarah could make out individual people standing beside their cars, phones in hand, recording what might be her final moments. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with a strange sense of determination.
She was not going to let these people down.
She was not going to crash in front of them. "Hawkeye 21, you're looking good," came the voice of Captain Morrison in his F-16.
"Nice and steady.
You've got this."
The encouragement helped more than Sarah wanted to admit.
She had always been proud of her ability to handle pressure, but there was something different about this situation.
This wasn't training, and it wasn't combat.
This was pure survival, and she was doing it in front of an audience. At 200 feet, Sarah could see the texture of the asphalt rushing toward her. The highway looked smooth and straight, perfect for her needs. She adjusted her angle slightly, aiming for a spot about a quarter mile ahead where the road was completely clear of vehicles.
100 feet. 50 feet. 20 feet.
The A-10's main landing gear touched down on Interstate 50 with a screech of rubber and a shower of sparks.
Sarah felt the aircraft bounce once, then settle onto the road with authority.
She immediately deployed her drag chute and stood on the brakes, feeling the Warthog slow rapidly as it rolled down the highway.
But something was wrong.
As she slowed through 60 miles per hour, Sarah noticed that her aircraft was pulling hard to the left. She fought the control stick, trying to keep the nose pointed straight down the highway, but the pull was getting stronger. That's when she saw it in her side mirror, a shower of sparks coming from her left main landing gear. The tire had blown during the landing, and now her aircraft was riding on the rim. Worse, the damaged gear was beginning to collapse under the weight of the aircraft.
"I've got gear failure," Sarah shouted into her radio. "Left main is collapsing."
The A-10 began to skew sideways on the highway, its left wing dropping toward the asphalt. Sarah fought desperately to maintain control, but physics was against her. The aircraft was slowing rapidly, but it was also heading inexorably toward the right shoulder where several cars full of onlookers were parked. Behind her, Captain Morrison watched in horror as the situation deteriorated. "She's losing it," he transmitted urgently. "Ground units, be advised the aircraft is heading toward the shoulder." Sarah could see the parked cars getting closer through her side window. In one of them, she glimpsed a family, parents and two small children, scrambling to get out of their vehicle. The sight filled her with a desperate strength she didn't know she possessed. With her aircraft sliding sideways at 30 miles per hour, Sarah made a decision that went against every instinct she had as a pilot. She pulled her left rudder pedal to the floor and simultaneously applied right aileron, intentionally spinning her aircraft into a ground loop. The maneuver was dangerous and could easily result in a catastrophic crash, but it was the only way to avoid the civilians on the shoulder. The A-10 spun around its center of gravity like a massive, heavy top. Sarah felt her body pressed against her harness as centrifugal force took hold. Her instruments became a blur of spinning needles and flashing lights. The world outside her canopy turned into a kaleidoscope of desert, highway, and sky. But the maneuver worked. As the aircraft completed its violent pirouette, it came to rest facing backward on the highway, its nose pointing in the direction it had come from. The left wing was down, resting on the asphalt, but the aircraft was intact and the civilians were safe. Sarah sat in her cockpit for a moment, her hands shaking as the adrenaline began to wear off. She was alive, her aircraft was in one piece, and no one on the ground had been hurt.
It was, by any measure, a successful emergency landing. "Hawkeye 21, are you okay?"
Captain Morrison's voice crackled through her headset. I'm fine, Sarah replied, her voice hoarse.
Aircraft is secure. No injuries.
As she began to shut down her systems, Sarah became aware of the sound of approaching sirens. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars were converging on her position from both directions on the highway. In the distance, she could see news helicopters already circling like vultures. But what caught her attention most was the sound of jet engines overhead. The two F-16s that had escorted her down were making a low pass over the crash site, their pilots undoubtedly taking photos and video for the incident report. Standard procedure, she told herself, but something about their presence made her uncomfortable. Sarah began the process of shutting down her aircraft, following procedures she had memorized years ago but hoped never to use.
As she worked through the checklist, she noticed something odd about her tail number placard.
The metal plate looked different somehow, older, more weathered than she remembered.
But that was impossible, wasn't it?
She had been flying this same aircraft for months. The fire trucks arrived first, their crews quickly surrounding the aircraft with foam and water in case of fuel leaks. Sarah could see the fire chief approaching her aircraft, his face grim behind his protective visor. Behind him came what looked like military personnel, Air Force security forces by their uniforms. As she waited for the all-clear to exit her aircraft, Sarah's mind began to race. The emergency landing had gone better than she could have hoped, but there would be questions.
Lots of questions.
An investigation would be launched to determine what had caused her system failures, and her every action would be scrutinized by people who had never faced the life-or-death decisions she had made in the last 30 minutes. But there was something else bothering her, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The way the F-16 pilots had reacted to her tail number, the strange look she was getting from the ground crew, it all seemed odd, somehow wrong. Captain Morrison's F-16 made another low pass, and Sarah could swear she saw him pointing at something on her aircraft. But what could he be looking at? Her A-10 was standard issue, nothing special or unusual about it.
Just another Warthog in the Air Force inventory.
Or was it? As the emergency responders continued their work around her aircraft, Sarah found herself staring at her instrument panel, trying to remember exactly how she had ended up in this situation. She had been on a routine training mission, practicing attack runs over the Nevada test range.
Everything had been normal until suddenly, it wasn't.
But now, sitting here on Interstate 50 with her aircraft disabled and emergency vehicles surrounding her, Sarah was beginning to realize that nothing about this day had been normal.
Nothing at all.
The fire chief was approaching her canopy now, giving her the thumbs up that it was safe to exit the aircraft. Sarah began the process of shutting down her engines and preparing to open her canopy. In a few minutes, she would climb down from her aircraft and face whatever questions were waiting for her. But first, she had to know what was bothering the F-16 pilots about her tail number. Sarah twisted in her seat and looked back at the vertical stabilizer of her aircraft. The numbers were clearly visible from her angle, 810992.
The numbers meant nothing to her. Just another tail number in the Air Force inventory.
But, as she stared at them, something nagged at her memory, some half-remembered briefing or conversation that she couldn't quite recall. The fire chief was at her canopy now, motioning for her to open it. Sarah reached for the canopy release handle, but paused for a moment. Once she opened that canopy, once she climbed down from her aircraft and began answering questions, there would be no going back. She had the strange feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. That this emergency landing, as successful as it had been, was just the beginning of something much larger and more complicated.
With a deep breath, Sarah pulled the canopy release handle.
The clear plastic dome swung open with a hydraulic hiss, and suddenly, she could hear the full cacophony of the emergency scene: sirens, radio chatter, the distant thrum of helicopter rotors, and the excited voices of the crowds of onlookers who had gathered to witness her dramatic landing. The fire chief extended a ladder to her aircraft, and Sarah began the process of climbing down from the cockpit that had been her world for the last terrifying half hour.
Her legs felt shaky as she stepped onto the ladder, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb.
As her feet touched the asphalt of Interstate 50, Sarah looked around at the scene of organized chaos that surrounded her. Emergency vehicles, military personnel, news crews, and civilian onlookers all seemed to be converging on her position. In the distance, she could see the two F-16s entering the traffic pattern for what looked like Nellis Air Force Base. But it was the expression on the faces of the military personnel that caught her attention. They were looking at her not with relief or congratulation, but with something that looked almost like suspicion. Or fear. "Ma'am, are you injured?" the fire chief asked, his voice professional but concerned. "No, I'm fine," Sarah replied automatically.
"Just a hard landing."
But, even as she said the words, Sarah knew that nothing about this situation was fine. The emergency landing had been successful, yes, but it was what came next that worried her. Because judging by the looks she was getting from the gathering crowd of officials, her troubles were just beginning. And, somewhere in the back of her mind, that tail number, 810992, continued to bother her.
There was something important about those numbers, something she should remember.
But, for the life of her, she couldn't figure out what it was. The first news helicopter was landing now, disgorging a crew of reporters and cameramen who immediately began setting up their equipment. Sarah watched them with growing unease. Whatever was happening here, it was about to become very public very quickly.
An Air Force colonel was approaching now, his expression grim and unreadable.
Behind him came several men in civilian clothes who had the unmistakable look of federal agents.
Sarah's unease deepened. This was not the normal response to an emergency landing, no matter how dramatic it might have been.
"Captain Mitchell," the colonel said as he reached her position. "I'm Colonel Harrison, base commander at Nellis.
Are you experiencing any injuries or medical distress?"
"No sir, I'm fine," Sarah replied, snapping to attention despite her disheveled appearance. "Good," the colonel said, but his tone suggested that nothing about this situation was good. "We need to debrief you immediately, and we need to secure your aircraft.
There are some questions about your flight today."
"Questions?"
Sarah didn't like the sound of that. "What kind of questions, sir?" The colonel glanced around at the crowd of emergency responders and onlookers, then leaned closer to Sarah.
When he spoke, his voice was low and urgent. "Captain, we need to know where you've been for the last 6 months. And we need to know how you're flying an aircraft that was reported destroyed in Afghanistan 2 years ago." Sarah felt the world tilt around her.
"Sir, I don't understand. I've been stationed at Nellis for 8 months. This is my assigned aircraft."
"I was on a routine training mission when, Captain," the colonel interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "According to our records, Captain Sarah Mitchell was killed in action in Afghanistan 14 months ago. And the aircraft you just landed, tail number 810992, was shot down over Kandahar province in October of 2023.
The desert highway seemed to spin around Sarah as the colonel's words sank in. Killed in action. Shot down. But that was impossible.
She was here, she was alive, and she had been flying routine training missions out of Nellis for months.
Hadn't she?
As the implications of what the colonel was telling her began to sink in, Sarah found herself staring at her hands, half expecting them to be transparent or ghost-like. But they looked solid and real, just as they always had.
"There has to be some mistake," she said weakly. "Some mix-up in the records. I'm not dead, and my aircraft wasn't shot down. I would remember something like that."
But even as she spoke the words, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Because somewhere deep in her memory, she could almost recall the sound of gunfire and the feeling of her aircraft shuddering under enemy fire.
Almost, but not quite.
The colonel was studying her with a mixture of concern and professional curiosity. "Captain, I know this is difficult to process, but we're going to need you to come with us for debriefing.
There are people who are very interested in talking to you." Around them, the emergency response was winding down. The immediate danger had passed, and now the investigation would begin.
But Sarah had the sinking feeling that this investigation was going to uncover things that none of them were prepared for. As she was escorted toward a waiting military vehicle, Sarah took one last look back at her A-10. The aircraft sat on the highway like a wounded bird, its left wing resting on the asphalt, emergency lights flashing all around it. It looked every inch the war machine it was designed to be. But if what the colonel was telling her was true, it was also a ghost. A phantom aircraft flown by a dead woman, both of them somehow returned from the grave to land on a lonely highway in the Nevada desert.
The last thing Sarah saw before climbing into the vehicle was one of the F-16 pilots taking photographs of her aircraft's tail number.
His expression was one of confusion and disbelief, as if he was documenting something that shouldn't exist. As the vehicle pulled away from the crash site, Sarah closed her eyes and tried to remember what had happened to her in Afghanistan. But her memory remained frustratingly blank, offering only the vague impression of danger and the distant sound of gunfire. Whatever the truth was, Sarah had the feeling that her quiet life as a training pilot was about to become a lot more complicated. The successful emergency landing on Interstate 50 wasn't the end of her adventure, it was just the beginning. The debriefing room at Nellis Air Force Base was stark and windowless, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look pale and sickly. Sarah sat across from a metal table, facing three men who had introduced themselves with titles that meant nothing to her: Colonel Harrison, whom she had met at the crash site, Agent Reynolds from the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, and Dr. Marcus Webb, a psychiatrist from Walter Reed Medical Center who had flown in specifically for this meeting. Sarah had been at the base for 6 hours now, subjected to medical tests, psychological evaluations, and more questions than she could count. The results, she was told, were inconclusive, a word that seemed to make everyone in the room very uncomfortable. "Let's go through this one more time, Captain," Agent Reynolds said, his voice carefully neutral. "Tell us about your last clear memory before today's flight." Sarah rubbed her temples, feeling a headache building behind her eyes. They had been over this material dozens of times already, but she forced herself to concentrate. "I woke up at 0500 hours, had breakfast in the officer's mess, attended the morning briefing at 0700, and went out to my aircraft for a routine training mission. Everything was normal." "And what was the date?" Dr. Webb asked, leaning forward slightly. "December 21st, 2025, Sarah replied automatically. Then, she paused, something nagging at her memory. "At least, I think it was. The days have been running together lately with all the training flights." The three men exchanged glances that made Sarah's stomach knot. She had seen that look before during the medical examination, the look of people who knew something she didn't, something important and probably unpleasant. "Captain," Colonel Harrison said gently, "what's the last thing you remember about your deployment to Afghanistan?" Afghanistan. The word sent a chill through Sarah that she couldn't explain. Images flashed through her mind: desert landscapes that looked nothing like Nevada, the sound of helicopters, the acrid smell of burning fuel. But the memories felt distant and disconnected, like scenes from a movie she had watched long ago. "I remember being deployed," she said slowly. "Bagram Air Base, I think. Flying close air support missions. But the details are fuzzy." "Do you remember October 15, 2023? Agent Reynolds asked. "You were flying a mission in support of a special operations team near Kandahar." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to force the memory to surface. For a moment, she could almost see it: a rocky valley surrounded by mountains, radio chatter filled with urgency, the distinctive whine of her A-10's engines as she dove toward enemy positions. But when she tried to focus on the details, the memory slipped away like water through her fingers. "I remember pieces," she said finally. "A valley. Mountains. But I can't put it together into a coherent sequence." Dr. Webb made a note on his tablet. "Memory fragmentation is common in cases of severe trauma. The mind protects itself by suppressing memories that are too painful to process." "But I'm not traumatized," Sarah protested. "I feel fine. I mean, I felt fine until you started telling me I was supposed to be dead." The three men were quiet for a moment, and Sarah could hear the distant sound of jet engines from the flight line outside. Normal sounds of a normal airbase, but nothing about her situation felt normal anymore. "Captain, we'd like you to look at something," Colonel Harrison said, sliding a tablet across the table. "These are gun camera footage from your wingman on that mission in Afghanistan." Sarah picked up the tablet with trembling hands. The screen showed a grainy black and white image of two A-10s flying low over mountainous terrain. The timestamp in the corner read October 15, 2023, 13:47 local. "The aircraft on the right is yours," Agent Reynolds explained. "Tail number 810992. Sarah watched as the two aircraft maneuvered through the valley, executing the kind of close air support mission she had flown dozens of times. Everything looked routine until suddenly, the right aircraft, her aircraft, was enveloped in a cloud of smoke and debris. "Surface-to-air missile," Colonel Harrison said quietly. "Probably a shoulder-fired manpad. Your aircraft took a direct hit to the engine section." On the tablet screen, Sarah watched her A-10 spiral out of control, trailing fire and smoke. The camera followed it down until it disappeared behind a ridgeline, followed seconds later by a massive explosion that lit up the valley floor. "Your wingman called in the crash," Dr. Webb said. "Search and rescue teams were dispatched, but the area was under heavy enemy fire." By the time they could reach the crash site 3 days later, there was nothing left but scattered debris. Sarah stared at the tablet screen, which had gone black. The silence in the room was oppressive, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of the base outside. "But, that's impossible," she said finally. "I'm sitting right here. I just flew that same aircraft this morning. There has to be some explanation." "We're hoping you can help us find one," Agent Reynolds said. "Because according to every official record, Captain Sarah Mitchell died in that crash 14 months ago. Her body was never recovered, but, given the extent of the explosion and the fact that the area remained under enemy control for several weeks, that wasn't unusual." Sarah felt dizzy, as if the room was spinning around her. "Are you saying I'm some kind of ghost? That I've been dead for over a year and just didn't know it?" "We're not saying anything definitive yet," Dr. Webb interjected. "But we do need to explore all possibilities. Tell me, Captain, have you experienced any unusual dreams lately? Any periods of time that you can't account for?" Sarah thought about it, trying to push past the growing panic in her chest. Now that he mentioned it, there had been strange dreams, vivid nightmares about burning aircraft and enemy gunfire. But everyone had nightmares, didn't they? It didn't mean anything. "Sometimes I have bad dreams," she admitted. "About combat. But that's normal for pilots who've seen action." "What about gaps in your memory?" Dr. Webb pressed. "Times when you couldn't remember where you'd been or what you'd been doing." Again, Sarah had to think. There had been a few instances lately where she'd found herself in places with no clear memory of how she'd gotten there. Once she had woken up in her apartment with her flight suit on, mud on her boots, and no memory of where she'd been. But she had attributed that to stress and fatigue from the intensive training schedule. "A few times," she said reluctantly. "But I've been working hard. Long hours. It's normal to be a little disoriented sometimes." The three men exchanged those looks again, and Sarah was beginning to hate that particular expression. "Captain, we'd like to show you something else," Colonel Harrison said. He reached into a folder and pulled out a photograph. "This was taken at Arlington National Cemetery 6 months ago." Sarah took the photograph and felt her blood turn to ice. It showed a military funeral, complete with honor guard and flag-draped coffin. But what made her heart stop was the headstone in the background, clearly visible in the image. It read, "Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, Captain, United States Air Force, July 12, 1992 to October 15, 2023. "Your funeral," Agent Reynolds said quietly. "Your parents, your sister, your fiancé, they were all there. The president sent a letter of condolence." Sarah stared at the photograph, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. In the image, she could see people she recognized, her mother, her father, her younger sister Jennifer. They were all dressed in black, their faces streaked with tears as they said goodbye to someone they believed was dead. "This isn't possible," Sarah whispered. "None of this is possible." "We agree," Dr. Webb said. "Which is why we need to figure out what's really happening here." A knock at the door interrupted them. A young airman entered and whispered something to Colonel Harrison, who nodded grimly. "Captain, we've been analyzing your aircraft," he said. "The results are interesting. The airframe shows signs of battle damage consistent with the gun camera footage we just showed you. Specifically, there's evidence of missile impact in the engine bay, along with fire damage throughout the aircraft." Sarah felt like she was drowning. "But I flew it this morning. It was working fine until the systems started failing." "That's another mystery," Agent Reynolds said. "Because according to our analysis, your aircraft shouldn't be able to fly at all. The damage is extensive enough that it should have crashed immediately after takeoff, if it could get off the ground at all." "And there's something else," Colonel Harrison continued. "We've checked the maintenance logs for tail number 810992. According to our records, that aircraft has been sitting in the boneyard at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base since November 2023. It was written off as a total loss after the Afghanistan incident." Sarah's world was spinning completely out of control. Every fact they presented to her contradicted everything she thought she knew about her own life. Either she was going insane, or something very strange was happening to her. "I want to see my apartment," she said suddenly. "I want to see my quarters, my belongings, my personal effects. If I'm supposed to be dead, then what happened to my stuff?" The three men exchanged glances yet again.
Captain, there is no record of you being assigned quarters on this base.
According to our housing office, there has never been a Captain Sarah Mitchell assigned to Nellis.
The panic that had been building in Sarah's chest finally broke through. Then, where have I been living? Where are my clothes, my photographs, my personal belongings?
We'd like you to show us, Dr. Webb said gently.
Can you take us to where you think you've been living? Sarah nodded, though she was beginning to doubt her own memory. Everything felt unreal, as if she was living in some kind of elaborate dream or hallucination.
But she had to know the truth, no matter how impossible it might be. 20 minutes later, Sarah was sitting in the back of a military police vehicle, directing the driver toward what she was certain was her apartment complex. The building was about 10 miles from the base, a modest complex that catered to junior officers and enlisted personnel.
Building C, apartment 237, Sarah said as they pulled into the parking lot. I've been living there for 8 months.
But, as they walked up to the apartment door, Sarah felt a growing sense of unease. The hallway looked different somehow, shabbier and more run down than she remembered. And, when they reached apartment 237, the nameplate beside the door read J. Martinez.
This can't be right, Sarah said, staring at the nameplate in confusion. This is my apartment. I have a key.
She reached into her pocket and pulled out a key ring, selecting the one she had been using for her apartment door. But, when she inserted it into the lock, it wouldn't turn.
Agent Reynolds knocked on the door.
After a moment, it opened to reveal a young Hispanic man in civilian clothes who looked confused and slightly alarmed at the sight of military personnel at his door.
Can I help you? He asked. Sorry to bother you, sir, Agent Reynolds said, showing his identification. We're investigating an incident. How long have you lived in this apartment?
About 2 years, the man replied.
Why? Is there some kind of problem? Sarah felt the last pieces of her certainty crumble away.
She had been so sure this was her apartment, so certain that she had been living there for months. But, the evidence was clear, she had never lived here at all.
Ma'am, are you all right? The man asked, looking at Sarah with concern. You look like you've seen a ghost. The irony of his words was not lost on anyone in the group. As they walked back to the vehicle, Sarah felt completely disconnected from reality. Nothing made sense anymore.
She couldn't trust her own memories, her own perceptions of what was real. There's one more thing we need to check, Dr. Webb said as they drove back toward the base.
We've arranged for you to meet with someone who knew you well before the Afghanistan deployment.
Maybe seeing a familiar face will help trigger some memories. The someone turned out to be Major Lisa Chen, Sarah's former squadron mate and closest friend in the Air Force. They met in a conference room at the base hospital, with Dr. Webb observing from the corner. But, when Major Chen walked into the room, her reaction was not what Sarah expected. Instead of relief or joy at seeing an old friend, Major Chen's face went white with shock and fear. "This isn't possible," she whispered, backing toward the door.
"Sarah is dead. I saw the crash footage. I was at her funeral.
I spoke at her memorial service."
"Lisa, it's me," Sarah said, standing and moving toward her friend. "I know this is confusing, but I'm here. I'm alive." But Major Chen continued to back away. "You're not Sarah. You can't be." Sarah had a scar on her left hand from a childhood accident.
She broke her nose in pilot training and it healed slightly crooked. She had a tattoo of a hawk on her shoulder blade.
Sarah looked down at her hands. No scar. She touched her nose. Straight and perfect.
And, when she reached back to feel her shoulder blade, there was no tattoo. "I don't understand," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "Neither do we," Dr. Webb said from the corner.
"But, we're going to keep looking for answers."
Major Chen had regained some of her composure, but she was still staring at Sarah as if she were looking at a ghost. "If you are Sarah somehow, then, tell me something only she would know.
What did we call our squadron commander in Afghanistan?"
Sarah searched her fragmented memories, trying to find some detail that would convince her friend. But, her memories of Afghanistan remained frustratingly vague and incomplete. "I can't remember," she admitted.
"I'm sorry, I just can't remember." Major Chen nodded sadly. Sarah would have remembered. "We called him the Iceman because he never showed any emotion, even in combat.
she came up with the nickname herself. As Major Chen left the room, Sarah felt utterly alone and disconnected from everything she had believed about herself. The woman who claimed to be her closest friend had looked at her with fear and confusion, unable to recognize her as the person she was supposed to be. "We're going to run some more tests," Dr. Webb said gently. "DNA, dental records, fingerprints, anything that might help us understand what's happening here." But Sarah barely heard him. She was thinking about the missing scar, the straight nose, the absent tattoo. If she was really Sarah Mitchell, then why didn't she have the physical markers that would prove her identity? And if she wasn't Sarah Mitchell, then who was she? Late that night, Sarah lay in a hospital bed at the base medical facility, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The DNA results wouldn't be back for several days, but she already suspected what they would show. She wasn't Sarah Mitchell, at least not the Sarah Mitchell who had died in Afghanistan 14 months ago. But she had Sarah's memories, or at least fragments of them. She could remember her childhood, her family, her training as a pilot. She remembered the taste of her mother's chocolate chip cookies and the feeling of flying her first solo flight. Those memories felt real and authentic, not like something that had been implanted or imagined. So what was she? Some kind of clone? A psychological experiment gone wrong? An elaborate hoax perpetrated for reasons she couldn't begin to imagine? Or was she something else entirely, something that defied rational explanation? As she lay there in the darkness, Sarah became aware of a sound outside her window. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the hospital's air conditioning system. But gradually it grew louder and more distinct. It was the sound of jet engines, specifically the deep rumble of A-10 engines. But that was impossible. It was well past midnight, and the base had shut down flight operations hours ago. Sarah got out of bed and walked to the window. The base was dark except for the scattered security lights that illuminated the runways and taxiways. But, as she watched, she could swear she saw the dark silhouette of an aircraft taxiing across the tarmac. Her aircraft. Tail number 810992. The sight should have been reassuring. After all, they had told her the aircraft was being secured and analyzed by investigators. But something about seeing it move in the darkness filled her with an inexplicable sense of dread. As she watched, the A-10 turned toward the main runway and began to pick up speed. Impossible as it seemed, the damaged aircraft was preparing to take off. But who was flying it? And where was it going? Sarah pressed her face against the window, trying to get a better view. For just a moment, she could swear she saw a figure in the cockpit, silhouetted against the aircraft's instrument lights. The figure looked small and slim, like a woman. Like her. Before she could process what she was seeing, the A-10 disappeared into the darkness beyond the runway lights. A moment later, she heard the sound of engines spooling up for takeoff, followed by the distinctive roar of an A-10 at full power. But when she looked out at the runway, there was nothing there. The base was dark and quiet, with no sign of aircraft activity. It was as if the whole incident had been a hallucination. Sarah stood at the window for a long time, wondering if she was losing her mind. The stress of the day's revelations might be causing her to see things that weren't there. But the vision had seemed so real, so vivid. And, somewhere in the distance, she could still hear the faint echo of jet engines, growing fainter as they carried their mysterious cargo into the night sky. As she finally returned to bed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her story was far from over. The emergency landing on Interstate 50 had been just the beginning of something much larger and more mysterious than anyone had imagined. And, tomorrow, when the DNA results came back and confirmed what everyone already suspected, that she wasn't really Sarah Mitchell, the real questions would begin. Questions about who she was, where she had come from, and what connection she had to the dead pilot whose identity she had somehow assumed. But, for now, all she could do was lie in the darkness and listen to the echo of phantom engines, carrying secrets she didn't yet understand into the vast Nevada night. The DNA results arrived 3 days later, delivered by a somber-faced Agent Reynolds who looked like he hadn't slept in days. Sarah sat in the same windowless briefing room, but this time she was joined by a new face, Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, a physicist from Los Alamos National Laboratory who specialized in what she vaguely described as unusual phenomena. "The results are unprecedented," Agent Reynolds began, sliding a folder across the table. "Your DNA is an exact match for Captain Sarah Mitchell, down to every single nucleotide sequence we tested." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Then, that proves it. I am Sarah Mitchell."
Not exactly, Dr. Hartman interjected, her voice clinical and precise. What it proves is that your genetic material is identical to that of the deceased Captain Mitchell. But identical DNA doesn't necessarily mean you're the same person. I don't understand, Sarah said, though she was beginning to get a sinking feeling in her stomach. Dr. Hartman opened her own folder, revealing charts and diagrams that looked like something from a science fiction movie. There are several theoretical explanations for what we're seeing. Cloning, for instance, though that would require technology far beyond our current capabilities. Quantum duplication, which exists only in theoretical physics. Or. She paused, as if reluctant to continue. Or what? Sarah prompted. Or you're experiencing what some researchers call temporal displacement, Dr. Hartman said. A theoretical phenomenon where consciousness or matter can slip between different timelines or realities. Sarah stared at the physicist, wondering if everyone in the room had lost their minds. Are you seriously suggesting that I'm from some kind of alternate reality? I'm not suggesting anything definitively, Dr. Hartman replied. But, we've analyzed your aircraft extensively, and the results are equally baffling. The metal shows signs of battle damage that match perfectly with the crash footage from Afghanistan, yet molecular analysis indicates that the damage occurred in a different quantum state than our reality. What does that even mean? Sarah asked, frustration creeping into her voice. Agent Reynolds leaned forward. It means that your aircraft was damaged in a universe that operates on slightly different physical laws than ours. The damage is real, but it happened somewhere else. Sarah felt like she was drowning in impossibilities. So you're telling me I'm some kind of interdimensional traveler who accidentally slipped into the wrong reality? We're telling you that we don't know what you are, Dr. Hartman said gently. But we're going to find out. The next several weeks passed in a blur of tests, interviews, and psychological evaluations. Sarah was kept in secure quarters at Nellis, officially listed as being in protective custody while the investigation continued. She was allowed limited contact with the outside world, but even her phone calls were monitored. The media attention had been intense at first. The dramatic highway landing had been captured on dozens of cell phone videos and had gone viral within hours. But the official Air Force statement had downplayed the incident, describing it as a routine emergency landing during a training exercise. They made no mention of the mysterious circumstances surrounding Sarah's identity. During her confinement, Sarah began to experience more of the strange episodes she had dismissed as stress-related. Sometimes she would wake up with no memory of how she had gotten to bed. Other times she would find herself in different parts of the base with no recollection of walking there. More disturbing were the dreams. Vivid, terrifying nightmares where she was back in the cockpit of her A-10, flying combat missions over landscapes that looked familiar yet somehow wrong. In these dreams, she was always being hunted by something, enemy fighters, surface-to-air missiles, or sometimes just an inexplicable sense of dread that seemed to follow her wherever she flew. But the most unsettling dreams were the ones where she saw herself from the outside, as if she were watching someone else fly her aircraft. In these dreams, she could see multiple versions of herself, some alive, some dying, some already dead, all flying identical A-10s through an endless maze of identical valleys and mountains. It was during one of these dreams that Sarah finally remembered what had happened in Afghanistan. She was back in the valley, flying low-level close air support for a special operations team that was pinned down by enemy fire. The mission had been routine until everything went wrong. Her wingman had been hit first, his aircraft spinning out of control before crashing into the mountainside. But it wasn't enemy fire that had brought him down. It was something else, something that defied explanation. As Sarah watched in her dream memory, she could see multiple aircraft in the same airspace, duplicates of her wingman's A-10, all flying the same mission but slightly out of phase with each other. The enemy missiles weren't targeting the aircraft in her reality. They were targeting the duplicates, the phantom versions that existed in parallel timelines. But the explosions were somehow bleeding through, creating a cascade effect that damaged aircraft in multiple realities simultaneously. Sarah remembered trying to radio for help, but the radio chatter was a nightmare of overlapping voices, dozens of versions of herself calling for support, all transmitting on the same frequency from different realities. The confusion had been overwhelming, making it impossible to coordinate any kind of effective response. And then, her own aircraft had been hit, not by a missile from her own timeline, but by debris from the crash of another version of herself in a parallel reality. The impact had been devastating, but not immediately fatal.
She remembered struggling with the controls, trying to keep her damaged aircraft in the air long enough to reach friendly territory. But that's when she had made the discovery that would haunt her forever. Looking out through her damaged canopy, she could see the other timelines more clearly. Dozens of versions of the same battle, playing out with slight variations in an infinite number of parallel realities. In some timelines, she crashed immediately. In others, she managed to escape. But, in every single one, something was fundamentally wrong with the fabric of reality itself. The barriers between timelines were breaking down, allowing matter and energy to slip between different versions of the same events. Sarah remembered making a desperate decision in those final moments before her crash. Using controls that shouldn't have existed on her aircraft, controls that appeared to be connected to some kind of quantum navigation system, she had tried to shift her consciousness to a timeline where she survived. The last thing she remembered was a blinding flash of light and the sensation of falling through an endless void filled with images of herself living and dying in infinite variations. When Sarah woke from the dream, she was no longer in her quarters at Nellis. She was standing in Hangar 18, the secure facility where her aircraft was being analyzed. She was wearing her flight suit, though she had no memory of putting it on, and her hands were covered in what looked like engine oil. The hangar was dark except for work lights focused on her A-10. The aircraft had been partially disassembled by the investigation team, with panels removed to reveal the internal damage that shouldn't have allowed it to fly. But, as Sarah approached, she could see that someone had been working on it. New components had been installed in the engine bay, parts that looked familiar yet somehow alien. They weren't standard Air Force equipment, but Sarah recognized them from her recovered memories. They were parts of the quantum navigation system that had allowed her to slip between timelines. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Sarah spun around to find a figure emerging from the shadows at the far end of the hangar. As the person stepped into the light, Sarah felt her heart stop. It was herself. Another version of Sarah Mitchell, wearing a flight suit that looked identical to her own but somehow different in ways she couldn't define. This other Sarah looked older, more worn, with scars that marked her face and hands. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "I'm the version of you that didn't make it out of Afghanistan," the other Sarah replied. "Or rather, I'm the version that did make it out, but into a timeline where everything I cared about was already gone." Sarah felt reality tilting around her again. "That's impossible. You can't be real." The scarred Sarah smiled sadly. "I've been saying that to myself for 14 months now. But, here we are, both standing in the same hangar, both equally real and equally impossible." "What do you want?" Sarah asked. "To warn you," the other Sarah said. "The quantum navigation system in that aircraft, it's not something we built. It's something we found. Something that was left behind by others who've been playing with the boundaries between realities." "Others?" "Think about it," the scarred Sarah said, moving closer. "Why would our A-10s have quantum navigation systems that don't appear in any technical manual? Why would the barriers between timelines be breaking down in that specific valley in Afghanistan? Someone has been conducting experiments, and we're just the latest test subjects." Sarah looked back at her aircraft, seeing it now with new eyes. The modifications that had been made to it weren't repairs, they were upgrades, improvements to a system that had already been installed without her knowledge. "But, who would do such a thing?" Sarah asked. "That's what we need to find out," the scarred Sarah replied. "Because whatever organization is behind this, they're not done with us yet. They've been monitoring our movements, studying our behavior, learning from each iteration of the experiment." "What experiment?" "Think about it," the scarred Sarah said. "How many ways can the same person die? How many different versions of the same events can you create? And what happens when you start mixing and matching elements from different timelines?" Sarah felt a chill run through her. "You're saying we're part of some kind of research project?" "I'm saying we're lab rats in the most sophisticated maze ever constructed. A maze made up of infinite variations of our own lives and deaths." As if to emphasize her point, the hangar light suddenly flickered and dimmed. For a moment, Sarah could swear she saw other figures moving in the shadows, more versions of herself, all wearing different variations of the same flight suit, all bearing different scars from different versions of the same catastrophic mission. "How many of us are there?" Sarah whispered. "Hundreds, maybe thousands," the scarred Sarah replied. "Every possible variation of that mission in Afghanistan, playing out across infinite timelines.
But, recently, the barriers have been breaking down more frequently. More versions of us are slipping between realities, ending up in the wrong timelines. Like me. Like all of us. The question is, why now? What changed that's causing the barriers to fail more often? The hangar lights stabilized, and the shadow figures disappeared. Sarah was left facing her scarred doppelganger in the harsh glare of the work lights, trying to process information that challenged everything she thought she knew about reality. "There's something else," the scarred Sarah said. "The people investigating you, Agent Reynolds, Dr. Hartman, even Colonel Harrison, they know more than they're telling you. This isn't the first time they've dealt with timeline displacement." "What do you mean?" "I mean, this is a pattern. Military personnel slipping between realities, aircraft appearing in timelines where they shouldn't exist, memories that don't match official records. It's been happening for months, maybe years." Sarah thought about the careful way her interrogators had phrased their questions, the specialized equipment that Dr. Hartman had brought to analyze her aircraft. They had been prepared for this situation in a way that suggested it wasn't entirely unprecedented. "So what do we do?" Sarah asked. "We find out who's really behind the experiments," the scarred Sarah said. "And we stop them before they kill any more versions of us." "How?" The scarred Sarah pointed to the modified A-10. "That aircraft is more than just a fighter jet now. It's a gateway between timelines, equipped with technology that can navigate the quantum foam between realities. If we can figure out how to use it properly, we can trace the quantum signatures back to their source." "That sounds incredibly dangerous." "Everything about our situation is dangerous," the scarred Sarah replied. "But the alternative is to remain trapped in this cycle forever, living and dying the same traumatic events across infinite timelines while someone else's studies are suffering for their own purposes." Sarah looked at her aircraft again, seeing it now as both a prison and a potential means of escape. The quantum navigation system gleamed under the work lights, its alien technology humming with barely contained energy. "Will you help me?" the scarred Sarah asked. Sarah nodded slowly. "What choice do I have?" "More choice than you think," the scarred Sarah said with a grim smile. "But, first, we need to get past the security systems. The people monitoring you don't want you to access that aircraft, especially not the quantum navigation system." As if summoned by her words, the hangar doors suddenly began to open with a mechanical whine. Bright light flooded in from outside, silhouetting a group of armed guards who were obviously responding to some kind of alarm. "Time to go," the scarred Sarah said urgently. "Follow me, and, whatever happens, don't let them separate you from the aircraft." Sarah heard shouts from the approaching guards, demanding that she identify herself and explain what she was doing in the secured hangar. But she was already moving, following her duplicate toward the A-10 with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since before the emergency landing. Whatever was happening to her, whatever impossible situation she had found herself in, at least now she had a plan. And, maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to break free from the cycle of endless repetition and discover who was really responsible for turning her life into an experiment. The guards were closing in, their flashlights cutting through the hangar's darkness like searchlights hunting for escaped prisoners. Sarah reached her aircraft just as the first security team rounded the maintenance scaffolding. "Stop where you are," one of them shouted. "Step away from the aircraft." But Sarah was already climbing up the ladder to her cockpit, muscle memory taking over as she prepared to start the engines. The scarred Sarah had vanished back into the shadows, but Sarah could feel her presence like a guardian angel watching over her escape attempt. The quantum navigation system activated with a sound like whispered thunder, and, suddenly, the hangar was filled with a low harmonic vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The guards stumbled, their equipment malfunctioning as reality itself began to bend around the modified A-10. Sarah strapped herself into the cockpit and began the startup sequence, watching as her instruments came alive with readings that had no business appearing on a conventional aircraft. The quantum navigation display showed a three-dimensional map of branching timelines, each one representing a different version of her current situation. She could see the timeline where she remained in custody, subjected to endless tests until she eventually died in a laboratory somewhere. She could see the timeline where the guards shot her as she tried to escape. She could see dozens of variations where everything went wrong in different ways. But she could also see a few timelines where she succeeded in escaping, where she found answers to the questions that had been plaguing her. Those were the timelines she needed to reach. The hangar doors were closing now, sealing her inside with the approaching guards. But Sarah was no longer worried about conventional obstacles.
She engaged the quantum navigation system and felt reality shift around her like water flowing over rocks. The last thing she saw before the timeline displacement took hold was Agent Reynolds running into the hangar, his face a mask of desperation and fear. He was shouting something, but his words were lost in the harmonic vibration that filled the air. Then, the world dissolved into light and possibility, and Sarah found herself flying through the space between realities, chasing quantum signatures that would lead her to the truth about who had been manipulating her life and death across infinite timelines. Behind her, in the hangar at Nellis Air Force Base, the guards found nothing but an empty aircraft and the lingering smell of ozone. The quantum navigation system was gone, along with the woman who had somehow learned to operate it. But Agent Reynolds knew it wasn't over. Whatever Sarah Mitchell had become, wherever she had gone, she would be back. And, next time, she wouldn't be the confused and helpless victim she had been during her initial interrogation. Next time, she would be hunting for answers, and heaven help anyone who tried to stop her. Sarah materialized in the cockpit of her A-10 above a landscape she didn't recognize. The quantum navigation system had carried her through the spaces between realities, and now she found herself flying over a military installation that looked both familiar and wrong. The buildings were laid out like Nellis Air Force Base, but everything was subtly different, older, more weathered, with architecture that suggested this was a timeline where history had taken a different path. The most disturbing difference was the aircraft on the runways below. There were dozens of A-10s, all bearing the same tail number as her own, 810992. Some were pristine and airworthy, others were battle-damaged wrecks, and still others showed modifications similar to the quantum navigation system installed in her aircraft. "Welcome to Timeline Zero," came a voice through her radio. It was the scarred Sarah, somehow communicating across the dimensional barriers. "This is where it all began." "Where are you?" Sarah asked, scanning the skies around her aircraft. "I'm in Timeline -7, running interference with security forces." "You're on your own for this part of the mission, but I'll be monitoring your progress." Sarah began her descent toward the mysterious base, noting that her approach wasn't being challenged by air traffic control. Either they were expecting her, or the base had been abandoned. Given what she could see on the ground, neither possibility was particularly reassuring. The runway she selected was lined with more A-10s, all bearing her tail number, all in various states of repair and modification. It was like looking at a graveyard of alternate versions of her own aircraft, each one representing a different iteration of the same impossible experiment. Sarah's landing was smooth despite her growing apprehension. As she taxied toward the flight line, she could see figures moving between the aircraft, maintenance personnel in coveralls that looked standard except for patches that read Project Mirror instead of normal unit designations. She shut down her engines and climbed out of the cockpit, immediately noticing that the air tasted different here. There was an electric quality to it, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm, and everything seemed to shimmer slightly around the edges. "Captain Mitchell," came a voice from behind her. Sarah turned to see a man in a colonel's uniform approaching. He looked like Colonel Harrison from Nellis, but older and bearing scars that suggested a much harder life. "We've been expecting you." "Have you?" Sarah replied cautiously. "And who exactly are you?" "I'm Colonel Harrison," he said with a slight smile. "Though not the version you met at Nellis." "I'm the Harrison from Timeline Zero, the original timeline where Project Mirror was first conceived." "What is Project Mirror?" The colonel gestured toward the rows of aircraft around them. "The most ambitious military research project ever undertaken. We discovered, quite by accident, that consciousness can survive the transition between parallel timelines under certain circumstances. The project was created to study and harness this phenomenon." Sarah felt a chill run through her. "You're the ones responsible for what happened to me in Afghanistan." "Among other things," Colonel Harrison admitted. "Though I should point out that what happened to you was largely accidental. You weren't supposed to survive the initial timeline displacement. The fact that you did, and that you retained enough coherent memory to function in an alternate reality, makes you an extremely valuable test subject." "Test subject?" Sarah's voice was sharp with anger. "You killed me in dozens of different timelines, and you call me a test subject?" "You weren't killed," the colonel corrected. "Your consciousness was displaced across multiple timelines simultaneously. Most subjects experience complete dissociation when this happens, they become catatonic or suffer complete personality fragmentation. But you've remained functional across multiple reality shifts." Sarah looked around at the aircraft graveyard surrounding them, each plane representing another version of herself that had been subjected to the same treatment.
How many of me are there?
Difficult to say exactly. We've documented over 300 distinct versions of Captain Sarah Mitchell across various timelines. Some are alive, some are dead, some exist in quantum superposition between the two states. The casual way he discussed the multiplication and destruction of her existence made Sarah's blood boil.
Why? What could possibly justify this kind of experimentation?
Colonel Harrison's expression became more serious.
Come with me. There's something you need to see.
He led her across the flight line toward a large hangar that hummed with electrical activity. As they approached, Sarah could see that the building was lined with some kind of metallic mesh that sparkled with its own internal light. Quantum isolation field, the colonel explained. Necessary to prevent reality distortions from affecting our work inside.
The interior of the hangar was filled with equipment that looked like something from a science fiction movie.
Banks of computers lined the walls, their screens showing three-dimensional maps of what appeared to be branching timelines. In the center of the space stood a massive circular platform surrounded by generators that crackled with barely contained energy.
This is our primary timeline manipulation facility, Colonel Harrison said.
From here, we can observe and influence events across thousands of parallel realities. But what drew Sarah's attention were the dozens of monitoring stations around the perimeter of the hangar. Each one displayed the vital signs and current status of what appeared to be different versions of herself. She could see timelines where she was still in Afghanistan, others where she was in military prison, and still others where she had never joined the Air Force at all.
You've been watching all of us, Sarah said, horror creeping into her voice. Every version of my life across every possible timeline.
It's necessary for the research, the colonel replied. We need to understand how consciousness responds to reality displacement, how memory functions across timeline barriers, and what psychological effects result from existing in multiple realities simultaneously.
But why me specifically? What makes my timeline displacement so important?
Colonel Harrison led her to a particular monitoring station that showed a complex web of interconnected timelines. Because you're not just a victim of timeline displacement, Captain. You're the key to understanding how it works. The display showed Sarah's original timeline, the one where she had died in Afghanistan, and traced the quantum signature of her consciousness as it scattered across dozens of parallel realities. But, instead of dissipating randomly, her displaced consciousness had followed specific patterns, creating stable connections between related timelines. Your consciousness acts as a quantum anchor, the colonel explained. When you shift between timelines, you create stable pathways that other displaced individuals can follow. In effect, you're a natural navigator in the space between realities. Sarah studied the display, beginning to understand the implications of what she was seeing. You're using me as a guide for other experiments.
Among other things. But there's more. The colonel activated another display, this one showing a massive anomaly in the quantum phone between realities.
3 weeks ago, we detected this, a tear in the fabric of spacetime itself, growing larger every day. The anomaly looked like a wound in reality, with timelines bleeding into each other in chaotic patterns that hurt to look at. Around its edges, Sarah could see the quantum signatures of thousands of displaced individuals, all trapped in the expanding zone of instability.
What caused it? Sarah asked.
We did, Colonel Harrison admitted.
Project Mirror has been manipulating timeline boundaries for over 5 years now.
We've displaced hundreds of subjects across thousands of timelines, studying their behavior and adaptation patterns. But the cumulative effect of all that manipulation has begun to destabilize the quantum substrate of reality itself. Sarah felt the full magnitude of the situation hit her like a physical blow.
You're destroying the multiverse.
We're trying to save it, the colonel corrected.
The tear is expanding exponentially.
If we can't find a way to stabilize it, it will eventually consume all possible timelines, collapsing the entire multiverse into a single, sterile reality.
And you think I can help you fix it? We think you might be the only one who can fix it.
Your consciousness has demonstrated the ability to navigate between timelines without becoming lost or fragmented. If we can enhance that ability through technological means, you might be able to travel to the center of the anomaly and repair the damage from within. Sarah stared at the display showing the growing tear in reality, trying to process what the colonel was telling her. The fate of infinite universes was apparently resting on her shoulders, and the people who had put her in this position were the same ones who had created the crisis in the first place. "What happens to all the displaced individuals if I succeed?" she asked. "Most of them will return to their original timelines," the colonel said. "The quantum pathways you've created will act as guides, pulling displaced consciousness back to where they belong."
"And if I fail? Then everything ends."
"Every possible version of every possible reality collapses into quantum foam, and existence itself ceases to have meaning." Sarah looked around at the hangar full of timeline manipulation equipment, thinking about all the versions of herself that were scattered across parallel realities. Some were suffering in military prisons, others were dead in crashed aircraft, still others were living lives that had been fundamentally altered by their displacement. "Why should I trust you?" she asked finally. "You've been experimenting on me and countless others without consent. You've killed dozens of versions of me across multiple timelines. How do I know this isn't just another experiment?" Colonel Harrison was quiet for a moment, his expression troubled. "Because if you don't help us, then every version of you across every timeline will cease to exist when reality collapses. And so will everyone else who has ever lived or ever will live." The weight of the decision pressed down on Sarah like a physical force. She could walk away, try to find her own solution to the timeline displacement problem, maybe even find a reality where none of this had ever happened. But, if the colonel was telling the truth, walking away would mean condemning infinite universes to destruction. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. The colonel led her to another section of the hangar where a heavily modified A-10 sat on the quantum manipulation platform. This aircraft was unlike anything Sarah had seen before. Its hull was covered with arrays of quantum sensors and timeline navigation equipment, and its cockpit had been redesigned to accommodate controls that looked more like a spaceship than a fighter jet. "This is your aircraft, Captain Mitchell, the original one from Timeline Zero. We've spent 2 years modifying it for deep timeline navigation. With this equipment, you should be able to penetrate to the center of the quantum anomaly and implement repairs from within the damaged spacetime." Sarah climbed up to examine the cockpit, noting instruments and controls that seemed to be designed for navigating through dimensions she couldn't even imagine. "How do I know any of this will work?" "You don't," the colonel admitted. "This is entirely experimental. No one has ever attempted to repair quantum damage on this scale before. And if the modifications don't work, then your consciousness will be scattered across the anomaly zone, probably forever. But, given the alternative, it's a risk we have to take." Sarah spent the next several hours studying the modified aircraft and its exotic controls, trying to understand systems that operated on principles she barely comprehended. The quantum navigation display showed the location of the anomaly, a roiling mass of distorted spacetime that existed in the gaps between all possible realities. As she worked, she became aware that she was being watched. Other versions of herself moved around the facility, some wearing the uniforms of different military services, others in civilian clothes that suggested they had come from timelines where their lives had taken radically different paths. One of them approached her, a version of herself that looked older and more tired, wearing the uniform of what appeared to be a space force that didn't exist in her original timeline. "You're the one they're sending into the anomaly," this other Sarah said. "I've been there. It's worse than they're telling you." "What do you mean?" "The damage isn't just to the quantum substrate," the older Sarah explained. "The anomaly is actively feeding on displaced consciousness, growing stronger every time someone gets lost between timelines. And, at the center of it." She paused, as if reluctant to continue. "What's at the center?" Sarah pressed. "Something that shouldn't exist. A consciousness that's been fragmented and reformed so many times that it's become something beyond human understanding. It's what's really driving the expansion of the anomaly." Sarah felt a chill run through her. Another displaced person? The first displaced person. Subject Zero of Project Mirror. They've been trapped in the quantum foam for 5 years now, and the isolation has driven them completely insane. They're using the anomaly to try to pull every possible timeline into themselves, becoming a kind of god of collapsed realities. The implications of this revelation hit Sarah like a hammer blow. So stopping the anomaly means confronting this Subject Zero. And probably destroying them, the older Sarah said grimly. "They were human once, but there's something else now. Something that sees the continued existence of multiple timelines as a personal affront." Sarah looked back at the modified A-10, understanding now why the mission was so dangerous. She wouldn't just be repairing quantum damage, she would be engaging in combat with an entity that had become one with the fabric of reality itself.
Is there any other way? She asked.
The older Sarah shook her head. We've been looking for alternatives for months. But Subject Zero won't respond to communication, and they become so integrated with the anomaly that removing them safely is impossible.
The only solution is to neutralize them before they can complete their plan to collapse all timelines. As Sarah absorbed this information, alarms began blaring throughout the facility.
The quantum isolation field around the hangar flickered and sparked, and several of the monitoring stations showed red warning lights.
What's happening? Sarah asked.
Colonel Harrison came running toward them, his face grim.
The anomaly just underwent another expansion event.
We're running out of time, Captain.
If you're going to make this attempt, it has to be now.
Sarah looked at the modified A-10, then at